Another episode of the Belt of Truth podcast. As you see, my guest is a frequent guest, one of my favorite guests, Dr. Tim. I'm glad to have you back. Chiropractor in Florida, church historian, studied law, and kind of a Renaissance man of many different fields, and especially looking at medical history, which brings us to this interesting, I guess we could say, 10-minute video that we both saw, and we thought, we ought to discuss this as Seventh-Day Adventists, especially a Seventh-Day Adventist church historian, Dr. Tim Pernick from Florida. I want us to just play this video and react to it. It's from a very popular channel called Redacted. And Dr. Tim, you've got some insight where you could help fill in some gaps where people are missing an understanding of Adventist history and medical history. So I wanted you on to help people navigate, frankly, some of the misinformation out there. Not that anybody means ill by it, but we can correct the record with truth and be filled with grace and truth. So that's our hope today. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and thanks, Dr. Tim, for coming back.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure, and I look forward to getting into this. It reminds me of the Proverbs 18:17. It says, "The first one to plead his case seems right until his neighbor comes and examines him." And so we're hoping to examine this because it sounded like really strong information. You and I both watched the video. Now we kind of get to react to it in our own way together. And I think there's some things there that are left out of this story. I think it's being simplified. I'm not exactly sure why, but there's some facts that need to be seasoned in this dish that they're serving here. And so let's go ahead and get into it.
Yep.
And I'll just stop it, and then you and I will talk, all right?
Yeah.
So here we go.
Well, this is a fun story about why we have...
Oh, just for our audience, we have that sped up. We haven't edited or touched the video. It's just at 1.25 times the speed. So here we go.
a food pyramid and why it has looked like it has since the early 90s and then subsequently led to skyrocketing rates of diabetes. One of the lesser known influences behind those guidelines comes from a small Christian denomination, and its role is rarely discussed. In the beginning of the show, I asked people to guess who it was. It wasn't Jehovah's Witnesses. It wasn't Mormons. It is not the Catholics. I'm going to tell you in just a second. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, along with the Department of Agriculture this week, rolled out this brand new food pyramid. It's basically an inversion of our old one.
Now, I have to stop right here. You're looking at this. It is interesting that we're going to have more meat and things like that. Like, notice that it's saying that grains are unequivocally bad for you. That's this whole new emphasis that's just unequivocally bad for you. Now, as a chiropractor, pretty much I would say 95% of everyone in my field is a paleo, keto, Atkins holdover. I mean, they love this stuff. And there's this whole trend here, even with the carnivore diet, saying, oh, you just eat nothing but meat and salt. And so there's this sort of renaissance of eating meat. Now people think they got to have beef sticks and give, beef tips to their children and all this other stuff. And it's interesting that this is reflecting this. And I don't think that this is really a scientific push as much as it is. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate a lot of things that Kennedy and his ilk are doing. And I do appreciate the idea of getting away from refined foods. I think we can both say that.
Yep.
But I feel like this is more of a trend than it is a science-based approach to this question of diet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and she made a comment early on that the older food pyramid led to skyrocketing rates of diabetes. Diabetes has increased decade over decade since the end of World War II. Over the last 75 years, the American diet has changed substantially. And it's not the food pyramid that caused the change.
Right.
In fact, we didn't actually eat that food pyramid. What changed over those 75 years was an increase in meat consumption, oil consumption, and sugar consumption.
Right.
And so if you want to look for the cause of the diabetes, increase in the curve, look to the change in the American diet. But they're accusing grains of being the base of that pyramid as being the cause of the diabetes, where actually we're consuming about the same amount of grains as we did 75 years ago.
That's a good point. I also think it's interesting to note that the fact of the matter is that veggie burgers at Burger King and other places is a recent thing. It is not an ancient thing. We've been serving burgers and eating things like that for a while. I also think a big component of it is that people were eating more home-cooked meals and eating foods taken from their gardens. So even if they were still eating the meat, even if they still were doing that, it wasn't as highly processed as what we have today. So I think the meat quality was better. I don't think that there was ever really a reduction in meat eating. I think seasonally, Catholics don't eat meat on Friday during, Lent or something like that. But otherwise, most people haven't reduced their meat intake. It's still been the cornerstone of every dinner. You and I have been to several different restaurants. There's very few vegetarian-only restaurants. It's always a steakhouse. It's always a place where meat is the cornerstone. So I think this is kind of like taking this idea and saying, well, grains are the problem. We have friends who go to Europe, and some of them swear that they're gluten intolerant or have celiac, and that's all they eat is pasta in Italy. And they say, well, I didn't have any symptoms there. And so one makes me wonder, well, are we really getting to the problem? Are the grains really the problem? Or is it maybe how we refine them? Maybe the type of glyphosate and stuff that we're putting on them. I tend to think this is an oversimplification of a problem. And I feel like we're being set up, or our denomination, our church is being set up to be the fall guy in this.
Yeah, she's going to speak about Seventh-Day Adventists, of course. That's what this whole video is about that we're reacting to. But, it should be mentioned also that sugar consumption has actually dropped over the last 25 years. Right. Grain consumption, even over the last 75. I mean, it had its ups and downs, but it's about the same now as it was 75 years ago, grain consumption. And that meat and oil have risen over the whole 75 years, including the last 25. Sugar dropped, meat and oil continued to rise. So if you're looking for culprits, again, I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but let's let you either comment or keep playing.
No, I was just going to say there's been a series of peer-reviewed studies that show that a lot of times they saturated fat is generally a marker for your meat consumption, and when they have noticed that type 2 diabetes corresponds positively to your consumption of meat and type 2 diabetes, like they found that. So it's not. I get that sugar can be bad, and we're not saying that you should just eat sugar all day. No. But we're essentially ignoring the steak in the room. So.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Adventist vegans, 50%, 60% reduced risk of type 2 diabetes than Adventist omnivores who eat meat. So
right.
There's a data point for you.
Exactly. All right. So let's get back into it.
It says that your diet should be made of mostly healthy fats, protein and dairy, vegetables and fruits, whole foods. If you go to realfood.com, it's a beautiful site, actually. And the government has all kinds of tips on how to eat real unprocessed foods, low in sugar and other types of processed grains. The old food pyramid was A-okay with processed grains, spaghetti, breads, crackers even. Like literally the government was telling you to make most of your diet out of crackers. Look down there, saltines. There's no nutritional value in that. That's a way to get diabetes because it's a constant insulin spike and have very...
I don't know about you, but have you ever thought that crackers were health food?
No, and I don't think America ate majority of their diet from crackers. And we agree with her. What you said earlier is we don't want refined grains. We don't want processed foods. Right. That's the common ground. Hit that again and again because there are some differences of opinion, but we're all on board with refined grains, bad. Sugar, bad. Nutrientless crackers. Let's pitch them in favor of something nutritious.
Exactly. All right. I just throwing that out there in case you and I got a different memo, but I'm pretty sure that's never been a part of the Adventist health message. All right, let's go on.
Very little dairy and meat. Why was it recommended? Who ever thought that it was preferable to eat breads and pasta as the main course of your meal and suffer this constant elevated glycemic spike? Well, this is an interesting story. Most of it told by this is the way I learned it through Jane Buxton's great book, The Great Plant-Based Con. And I'm going to summarize.
All right, so I have to stop right here. I just to tell the audience, to be completely fair, I probably really should read this whole book. I have not read this whole book. I am familiar with some of the arguments used by people who write these type of books. So I do get it, but I probably should read it because I'd love to see the footnotes for everything that this lady is going to say next. I have not looked at all the footnotes, but I would love to have read them because if there aren't footnotes there, I would be greatly disappointed because it seems to me a tragedy of historical retelling. But if there's footnotes, I'd be happy to look them up because I did my own homework and I haven't been able to verify most of the claims she's going to make, but we'll let her make them. Anything you want to add to that, Scott?
No, go for it.
All right.
Summarize it for you, but I have many times recommended that you read this book, and here is another time. So this is not the only story of how profitable processed foods came to dominate the American diet, but it is a big one. In 1863, a woman named Ellen G. White said that God gave her a message in a vision, and that message was that humans should eat what she called the Garden of Eden diet. By that, she meant fruits, nuts, vegetables, and seeds, and no alcohol, no tobacco, no meat, and very little dairy. This was part of the religion she would go out on to found. It was the Seventh-Day Adventist Church.
Okay, so this is interesting because this sounds like that no one had this idea about eating according to the Garden of Eden until 1863. That's what she's sort of saying here. Well, that's not true. In 1847 and in 1845, there was a movement that started in Great Britain, and these were vegetarians, and they were led not by this idea that they were saving the planet from climate change. They didn't believe that back then. They believed that it was wrong to. They were vivisectionists, so they were anti-vivisectionists. So they didn't believe that cutting open an animal while it was alive to study it was not good. They didn't believe that was good, but they wanted to eat a diet that went back to Eden. The idea was that if we ate less refined foods, if we ate things according to Genesis 1:29, the things, the fruit, the seeds, the fruits, all that stuff, they felt that would prepare them for heaven. So this was an evangelical movement well before Adventists had ever mentioned this. There's a book that was actually attacking Ellen White, and their point is what I'm making. They said that she stole from all these other groups, which she didn't, because there's some very distinctive things. But what this author, Ronald Numbers, points out in this book called Prophetess of Health is that this idea of the health message was not distinctive to Adventists. It was everywhere. It was everywhere. It wasn't just them. One of the famous proponents of it was Sylvester Graham. And everyone thinks of graham crackers like, oh, well, graham crackers, that didn't work. But that's not what he advocated. Graham crackers, at least what we have today, is a bastardization of what he believed. He believed
like Frosted Flakes?
Right.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that, I'm sure.
We will. But the point is that Graham believed that in order to improve mental health, which he believed that, improve spiritual vitality, which he believed, that we should try to eat a diet, and of course, our own health, our own physiological health, we should eat a diet that is in harmony with what God designed man to eat. And so he advocated eating very coarse grains and very black bread, thick, coarse, because there was even a problem back then. People forget this, that people were eating very light breads, which were almost pastry oriented, and people were getting sick and not getting healthy. And this is before they knew about pellagra. Pellagra is a vitamin B3 deficiency, and vitamin B3 is niacin. And when that's stripped out of the grain husk, you're eating bread with almost no nutrients. So they were noticing, even though they didn't know what pellagra was back then, or they knew what it was, but they didn't know what it was caused by, they were like, hey, this is the way to do it. A Catholic in Germany named Father Knipe, he was a surgeon to one of the Rothschilds. I want to say Nathan Rothschild was one of his patients. And these wealthy patrons would come see Father Knipe. He would have them do hydrotherapy, and he made them eat coarse black bread because he knew it was healthy. So, and this was earlier than Ellen White had ever come up with this message. So the point is that to say that this was just the Seventh-Day Adventists coming up with this idea is to ignore a whole swath of history where people were awakening to this idea of eating less refined foods, eating more fruits and vegetables, not eating meats because it wasn't prescribed in the original Garden of Eden. It had nothing to do with particularly doctrinal distinctiveness of the Adventist church. It was something that the Adventist church absorbed because of our ideas, our message, and our worldview.
And improved upon, right? I mean, there were some things Jackson and Graham taught that were discredited, but what Ellen White was shown and wrote about has not been. So that's really quite remarkable and that's where the accusations of plagiarism come in. Yeah. Those who aren't ignorant of the history that you're sharing. Well, she just stole it from those guys, but then how did she know to selectively plagiarize the correct items and leave the nonsense aside? Because she nailed it over and over again. Absolutely. And medical science looks back and like, how did she know? And I'm sure you're going to get into that, how this was actually practiced with the sanitarium, but I don't want to take you ahead of that. But that's important to say. And just real quick before you continue, did Ellen G. White found the Seventh-Day Adventist Church?
No, she did not.
That's what was stated there. I just wanted you to clarify about the origins of the church.
Yeah, no, it's funny. Mary Baker Edie was the founder of the church, the church
Christian Science.
Christian Science thing. Yeah. She was the founder. She was a mesmerist and spiritualist. And so, but Ellen White was not the founder. As a matter of fact, there were a cluster of men and her and a few women who, especially Rachel Oakes, who was important for establishing the Sabbath. But no, she was not the founder. She was an integral part. She was certainly an important influence and leader, and many people look to her for guidance in many ways. And her writings, I think, testify to the validity of all the information in them. But she was not the founder, and sometimes she would be overruled, and people sometimes did what they wanted to do despite her pleadings. So no, she was not like a Mary Baker Edie. She was not like a Joseph Smith.
No,
she was like a Charles Russell Taze. She wasn't like any of those people. So, yeah, let's go on. Let's see what she says next.
Did any of you get that right? Anyone in the chat? Seventh-Day. I saw a few. You did. Now, she founded this church in Battle Creek, Michigan, one of the families that would help her establish the church.
So I just have to stop right there. It took a while for the church to eventually come to Battle Creek, Michigan. It wasn't initially there. They were in the burned over district, which was up in New York, and they lived over there. It took a while for the Review and Herald, which was our church organ, which basically we put all of our writings in, that to move over there. So it took a while for Battle Creek to be a haven. And yes, there were some wealthy families out there, and the Kellogg's were one of them. And the reason why they moved some of our early institutions over to Battle Creek was because these people were so generous that they offered to give them their land and they offered to fund it. So no, they didn't just show up at Battle Creek and fund it. As a matter of fact, later on, Ellen White would write a series of letters and messages to people there telling people to get out of Battle Creek because we were a worldwide church and we need to spread all over the world. And we shouldn't have a concentration of influence in any one city. So again, I know she's oversimplifying things, but facts do matter, I think.
The dad was a man named John Preston Kellogg. Do you recognize that name? You probably do if you've ever been in an American supermarket. Kellogg had 11 children. One of them, John Harvey Kellogg, as a young man, was given a job to typeset the books of Ellen White. And so her Seventh-Day Adventist.
So she's going to go on for she's going to make an interesting point here about how John Harvey Kellogg was the typesetter and did all this. I don't know. I'd have to look if he actually worked for the Review and Herald as a typesetter. What I do know is that John Harvey Kellogg was into publishing and into writing, and he worked closely with James White, and he was seen as a precocious young man. And this is why they eventually invested in him. But I don't know about that. And I also believe that at the time that he was writing, at the time that he was with the Whites, both James and Ellen, people like to pretend that the health message, when it happened in 1863, gained worldwide acceptance, or it gained acceptance in all the Seventh-Day Adventists. This was something that had to unfold slowly. Not everyone understood it. Not everyone was on board. Some people said I could never give up meat because I live in a remote area. I can't have access to vegetables. And there were letters going back and forth. But Adventists were starting to have a health awakening. We were awakening to different remedies. We were awakening to using things to help heal people. We were awakening to diet. Diet's the big one, but even tobacco. We had spittoons in our early churches where people would spit tobacco in the church. And there was a plea saying, hey, why don't you save money on your tobacco and donate that so we can get more of the Review and Herald articles out to unbelievers. So this idea that it was just Kellogg was reading Ellen White's writings, and I have a feeling that at the time he would have been reading them, there would have been very few and far between to read. This was a hard message, and it was something that she said would be progressive, and that's something that would develop over time. So again, this is, all being very fair, this may just be overly simplification, but again, facts do matter because Kellogg was an important part of that awakening for the health message.
Adventist books and her temperance movement were what he would typeset. And back then, this is the 1800s, you had to letter by letter. So he was clearly reading the books and heavily influenced by the temperance movement. The temperance reformers believed that citizens were plagued by disease because of overstimulation and immoral behavior. So they set out to curb these things by abstaining from alcohol and meat, processed I lost my way. I was going to say, okay. From abstaining from alcohol and meat and practicing sexual restraint and promoting a balance between exercise, rest, and cleanliness. They were also very big on preventing masturbation. John Harvey Kellogg also typeset books on that subject too.
Okay, so I have to stop right here. There probably were no books on, and it wasn't called masturbation; it was called self-abuse back then. There were probably no books on that at this point. I'm sure it might have been condemned somewhere, but there were no books on that point. This idea that he's just reading her writings, typesetting, is an oversimplification. He would have dinner with the Whites. He spent a lot of time with them. He attended church with them. It wasn't like he's this surreptitious, impish character reading this typeset and coming to this conclusion. The other thing I have to point out is that this idea that it's meat, caffeine, and get away from sexual immorality. The temperance movement that Adventists began, first of all, starts with faith in God. It starts with bodily integrity. That we were some of the first to advocate staying away from drugs. And people have a problem with that today, but we were like, hey, mercury dosing isn't going to help you. Strychnine dosing isn't going to help you. We advocated hydrotherapy, fresh air, pure water. We were first and foremost in establishing things that would build the body up versus this idea. We were just against meat and tobacco. Well, she doesn't even say tobacco. We were definitely against the tobacco. We were definitely against coffee and stimulants and things like that. We were against a lot of these things which people had become wrecked in their lives from doing. The other thing is that as far as the sexual immorality practice, that's not unique to us. You could look at documents of other Christian denominations at that time, and they were against masturbation or self-abuse.
Including Graham.
Right. You could even go to the New England Journal of Medicine at that time, and you would see articles talking about perhaps masturbation being a part of debility for people. There were studies by the early phrenologists who were considered the scientists at the time, and I don't think they're wrong about this, but they felt that sexual immorality and masturbation, all that led to insanity. Now, again, insanity is harder to find, but the idea that it would lead to a deranged mind. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that to this day, and a lot of people roll their eyes. Oh, well, we know it's safe and effective. Where have we heard that before? But we know that masturbation doesn't cause any problems. But here's the thing. There's now a body of literature growing out there, both in the science community and the social community, which is demonstrating that all the porn that men and women are looking at is destroying their lives. There's now a syndrome where men are unable to perform. They are completely impotent when they are with a woman because they have looked at so much pornography. There's even other psychological ramifications that have been published in articles in peer-reviewed journals talking about the depression and anxiety men get from repeating these same behaviors. Andrew Huberman, who is I believe a neurophysiologist out of Stanford, talked about how by watching pornography and engaging in masturbation, you are essentially undermining your reward cycle in your brain. In other words, you're causing your brain to get, for very little work, a massive dopamine hit, and you're creating this positive feedback loop, which is debilitating you, and it's arresting your neurological development. So the fact is, and I know a lot of people like this, oh, those crazy religious nuts, what were they thinking? But the research has shown that maybe some of the things that they were saying about masturbation were probably right. And they were not only right then, but they're becoming right today.
Yep. We've got a session on that in A Greater Lust, which is on this YouTube channel, on the Belt of Truth YouTube channel. Just go to playlists, go to the series Addicted to Purity, and there's a session called A Violent Vice, 19th Century Morals Meet 21st Century Science. Exactly what you're talking about, Dr. Tim. And Ellen G. White did write about that. 1864, Appeal to Mothers. But I don't understand the point. Like, John Harvey Kellogg was reading Ellen White's writings. A lot of people have read them and found them to be valid and practice the things in them. So I don't know, maybe there's kind of like a conspiracy theory here that I'm missing that's coming yet, but thank you for sharing that history, because that's helpful to bring this in perspective. This is not an Ellen White thing. No, it's not. And I think you're right. I think it's sort of a guilt by association. He's reading the writings of this crazy woman, and then he becomes crazy. I think that's where she ultimately ends up going. But again, when you're not even on the right foot with the facts, you're just making a point for who knows what.
Let's see what she says.
That told mothers that it was their responsibility to stop their sons from masturbating, or else they would suffer from headaches, weak backs, spinal illnesses, and blindness. That's where we get that joke that if you do that, you'll go blind. That came from the temperance movements. They literally said this in books. So,
okay, I just have to stop right there. I've read pretty much, I would say, most of Ellen White's writings. I've never seen those two things linked. I have read a lot about Kellogg, and I don't recall him ever saying that it led to blindness. He did say that it would debilitate the organs. He did say that it would inflame the genitals. He did say that it could lead to low back pain. He did say a lot of those type of things, but in some of it, he was theorizing. He definitely looked at it to debilitating the mind and all those other things. So yes, he did say some of those things, but they always like to lampoon it the next level. Oh, well, no one went blind from that. And that's interesting because I feel like that's almost a red herring. It's almost like a way of discrediting the whole thing. Say, well, someone said, because we don't have a footnote here, that you go blind when you do that. Like you and I just talked about, let's say that you don't go blind, but it ruins your marital life. Like you get married in your, let's say your 30s, and you spent a good decade living in sin, looking at pornography, and now you have to rehabilitate yourself with your wife because you've ruined yourself for marriage.
Yeah, there's way better and more important and more motivating reasons to practice purity than eyesight. And blindness is a relative term. It's a degradation of the function, the ocular function, and that actually has been studied. And worse vision at night due to zinc deficiencies. So this would be more applicable to men in this practice. But yeah, we cover that in that session. We
awesome.
look into it's pretty interesting. Like, because that would be those things. Those quotes would be the ones we'd be like, kind of not wanting to acknowledge are in there. And some of them, okay, let's just take it head on. Let's look at the science. I believe this is inspired content. So let's take a look. The whys and the wherefores. Sometimes she says, I'm not aware of. I was shown. And so here's the prescription for health. And every time we practice it, it works out.
That's a good point. The stuff that we have found out about, because of there's so much pornography usage and all these other things, the things that we're seeing now really do demonstrate that a lot of these warnings, which were made very serious and were it almost seemed like a moral alarmism, weren't that far off, considering the damage that has been done to both men and women.
100%.
Books about this movement would influence Kellogg, and it would become his life's purpose, which motivated him to make these bland-tasting cereals and prescribe a vegetarian diet.
So I just have to point this out that cereal. So Kellogg, when Kellogg started to invent cereal, when he was getting into cereal, granola was already invented. He had to call it granulose because he couldn't say granola because the patent was already utilized on it. So there was already people inventing it because people were thinking about ways of making others healthy and cheap. And again, what people don't realize is that when you don't have great refrigeration, making your diet mostly depend on meat is not good for you. So the idea is finding ways to get people to eat things that would help them. And again, Kellogg himself, while he becomes a pioneer in the cereal industry, was not the first. There were many others who began this, but through the sanitarium and his work there, it became more popular. And as far as bland, I think if it were so bland and awful, then they wouldn't have sold millions and millions of boxes of it. I mean, his brother.
And this wasn't loaded with sugar, right? I mean, when you refer to it as bland, are you saying there's not enough sugar in it? So what's the problem? Too much or too little sugar here? So they made some nutritious cereal. People loved it.
Right. You can't win on this one. If they add sugar, they're condemned. If they don't add enough, they made a bland cereal. You can't win. But
they didn't add sugar. This was actually healthy. This isn't the Kellogg's of today, right?
Right, absolutely. But again, they used to do rolled oats, and they would do fruit and things like that. The dried fruit, like we think of granola, they had their own version, which they called granulose. So
did Kellogg invent peanut butter too?
People say that he did. I don't think he did. I know some people have said George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver did not invent peanut butter. Some argue that Kellogg did because it was a good butter substitute. I know that he experimented with other nut butters as well, which we use today. I mean, there's probably most people watching this have had some form of nut butter, whether almond butter, cashew butter, peanut butter. Well, and peanuts, as we know, aren't really nuts; they're legumes. Right. But either way,
well, he was a genius. When I hear a podcast like this, I'm kind of I have like an indignation on Kellogg's behalf.
Yes,
that man was one of the greatest inventors, innovators, medical health reformers in history. I mean, he's just an intellectual giant compared to myself or any of us that would look back and be like, he made bland cereal. Oh, come on. Let's give this guy some credit. Let's be fair.
I mean, look, there were people who complained about sometimes the fare at the sanitarium being bland because they really tried to minimize certain spices and things like that. And they eventually...
that's a compliment.
That's right.
It's not ultra processed food. It's not going to taste as overstimulating as the junk food of the food industry. These guys were really doing food right.
Exactly. So there was an article that was published in 1907 by Yale, and it was a Professor Irving Fisher, and he was so impressed with Kellogg that he does a study, and we'll get to the study later on. But the reason why I'm bringing it up is that Kellogg's influence extended so far that you have presidents and people from Yale researching the things that he's doing and analyzing it because he was so influential in his field. I mean, it's amazing to see what he was able to accomplish. And he is one of the most tragic, enigmatic, and incredible figures of history. Tragic because you see how he ends up.
Yeah. Mention that, because I said some really nice things about him. That was the early manifestation of Kellogg. He becomes a eugenicist and a pantheist. Tell us about where he did end up, so we're making sure the facts matter here.
Absolutely. Kellogg, as I said, just like with Graham, he believed that man was created in God's image. So he believed that eating a diet closely related to how God designed man would improve him. He also believed in outdoor exercise. He believed in fresh air. He believed in all those things, trusting in God, all of that. And he was a pioneer in health. There's Dr. Mayo. Dr. Mayo is where we get the Mayo Clinic from. Okay. And Dr. Mayo would do surgeries on people. And surgery back then was super barbaric. I mean, you cut some dude open, take out, something and put him back. And there would be infections and problems and things like that. And it would leave horrible scars. Kellogg his reputation for being one of the best surgeons in the country was so well known that when Dr. Mayo looked at a scar of a patient, he would say to him, "Have you seen Dr. Kellogg in Battle Creek, Michigan?" And they'd say, "Why, yes, I have." They'd say, "I know, because the scar is so neat and so small that he is the only one who's doing surgeries like that." So this gives the idea of the careful attention to detail. This guy went around the world and traveled. He was super influential. Unfortunately, with his great start and his pushing of natural remedies and things like that, eventually he started to be led away into pantheism, which is the idea that God is in everything. There's no judgment, that we all have a spark of the divine in us. And then that unfortunately led him to eventually believe in things like eugenics. And he believed in mandatory medicine, and he believed in evolution towards the end of his life. Believing in evolution.
I didn't know that part.
Yeah.
Was he influenced by Mary Baker Edie? I thought it was Eddie all these years. It's Edie.
No, he was not. He was not influenced by her.
Okay, because that idea of the spark of the divine, I wondered if he was, but no influence there. That he came up with these false ideas on his own, basically.
Pantheism is a form of vitalism, and vitalism was a pseudoscientific theory that existed back then. It was coming to prominence in the 1890s. And people in my profession, chiropractors, still believe in it this very day. It's the idea that there is a universal intelligence which has programmed the cells of your body. And so every cell in the body has a spark of the divine. And the job of the practitioner is to help release the spark of the divine, and you can do all your own healing and all this other stuff. And it sounds like a nice theory, but this was thought to be science. And partly it was influenced by spiritualism. because this idea that when people have an immortal soul and they can communicate with the living and all this other stuff, so there has to be some sort of there has to be a fingerprint of this immortal being which is inside of us in every single cell, and if we can just get that to move a certain way, we can produce healing from within because we have some latent powers. And so this was something that had Eastern mysticism tints to it, but when it crossed over into the West, it had this pseudoscientific stain with it, and doctors and other people like Kellogg started to be influenced by it.
Okay, so we don't endorse the Kellogg of the 19 teens and 20s. We like
right.
19th century Kellogg to the extent that he didn't get everything right, but to the extent that he actually followed Ellen White's writings, he nailed it. Didn't they ask him one time, how do you stay so far ahead? What's that conversation, that quote again? You shared that once before on our broadcast.
I forget, but basically, I forget the exact quote, but basically the answer was that he reads what she says. He reads what she says. He prays about it, and then he goes to research it, and it ends up being so. So that's what he does. He applies it.
Yeah, and that was an answer to the question, Dr. Kellogg, how do you stay so far ahead of the rest of the medical profession?
Yes.
He basically credited the prophetic gift through Ellen G. White.
Yes. And I mean, again, Kellogg, there's so many ways that Kellogg was ahead of the curve. She's going to bring up something else, but I just want to say this. Probiotics, Kellogg was ahead of the curve. He was so far ahead of the curve that it took us into about the 21st century to really catch up. Huh. So Kellogg, she's going to mention him with soy milk. He did not invent soy milk, but he believed that soy had a great balance of proteins, calories, and things like that. But he also believed that it wasn't entirely nutritious. And so what he began to do is his experiments with probiotics. He very much looked at milk, and he thought milk had a lot of good properties to it, particularly when it was cultured. It had a lot of good bacteria into it. And I have to point this out, that Kellogg at this time and most Adventists were not vegans. They were called abstainers. They're in the article in 1907 with Irving Fisher. They make a delineation between vegetarians who would be considered vegans, and they call them flesh abstainers. They still used eggs. They still used some milk. They still used cream. They still used yogurt. They still used things like that. They stayed away from a lot of cheeses, but eggs, yogurt, cream, and those they did use. Those were used all the time. So this idea that they were hardcore vegans hugging trees just isn't the case. But anyways, back to my point about him and soy milk and probiotics is that he was so moved by probiotics that he wrote in one of his journals that he said that he felt that if you could give everyone enough acetyldophus bacterium, if you could get them to ingest that in a mental ward, that you would clear out half of its inhabitants. He believed that most of those people there their deranged mind was there because they had a deranged gut. And listen, the amount of research which connects the gut and the brain is overwhelming now. And I mean, even now we're treating autism by doing fecal swabs. And this was the Arizona State University, where they're actually taking a fecal transplant from a healthy donor, putting in a kid with autism, and they're watching their behavior change, all because of microbes. And Kellogg was saying this long ago. Fascinating story. So there was a family in Canada who it was rare. They had, I think, 5 to 7 children at once, which is crazy. This was before birth hormones and all this stuff. And the mother obviously couldn't produce enough milk to sustain the children. And so Kellogg sent to them a whole case of his soy milk, but he had probiotics in the soy milk. They said, hey, mix this with a little bit of the breast milk and give this to your kids. It will help them grow, because they were having failure to thrive. They weren't getting enough nutrition. So the family did that, and every single one of those kids lived.
Awesome.
So this is what my point is that this guy was ahead of the curve. Did he say a lot of crazy things, especially in the end? Absolutely. Was he wrong about things that he said about Christ? Wrong about evolution? Yes. Was he wrong about mandatory medicine at the end? Absolutely he was. But man, oh man, to simply just wipe him away as some fanatic and crazy is just to ignore the vast swath and the complexity of the character of what he truly represents and represented at the time.
Dr. Tim, this is why I called you up, because I'm like, they're going after Kellogg. He's just made bad cereal. I'm like, there's so much more to this man. You're telling stories I didn't even know about. You could go on for hours about the legacy of John Harvey Kellogg, especially that good phase before he apostatized. But there's more in the video, isn't there?
Absolutely. Let's get on to it.
By 1882, he invented the cornflake, and by the early 1890s, he would bring it to market with his brother Will. He actually invented.
Okay, so this was hotly debated. This was this was actually taken to court, and Will Keith won. He beat his brother in court because Kellogg said that he invented it, and Will Keith, his brother, who founded Kellogg's, and keep in mind, John Harvey Kellogg was not ever a board member of the Kellogg's Corporation. He was not. Will Keith was, and Will Keith essentially was a backslidden Seventh-Day Adventist. He had some of the faith, but once he left and started making money, it was gone. It was all gone. And sadly, John Harvey really mistreated his brother Will Keith. He would make them stand outside of the bathroom and take notes. He would have him chase around him. He thought that Will Keith was out of shape, and so he'd make him follow after him and write notes on a pad of paper while John Harvey rode a bike. So he really mistreated his brother. But when they took the case to court on who the cornflakes actually belonged to, the courts ruled unanimously that it was Will Keith, that he made the patent, that he was the inventor. It's not that he didn't get his information from John Harvey. One of the reasons why Will Keith did this is he was so upset that John Harvey would invite anyone over. They said that John Harvey probably had that slipped through his fingers, probably tens of millions of dollars in back then money, not today's money, back then money, which was like $1 billion, essentially. John Harvey was so not ever thinking about money. The Sand was perpetually in debt. There was always problems that John Harvey basically, he allowed people to come in and see what they were doing. One of the guys who came to the sanitarium, who was observing everything they did and took notes, was C.W. Post. And C.W. Post saw what they were doing in the sanitarium, says, I'm going to make my own breakfast cereal. And he started the Post Cereal Company. So there were always people coming in, and John Harvey Kellogg didn't have this idea, well, I'm not sharing this. John Harvey Kellogg was happy to share everything with everyone. And so he let tens of millions of dollars slip through his finger. And his brother Will Keith was like, whoa, we can't do this anymore. We're going to file a patent, and we're going to make our own cereal. And he even had lawsuits with him and C.W. Post. I mean, it was a battle. People do not understand that there were serious wars for cereal back in those days, because apparently it wasn't so bland to the palates of people who are buying it box to box and case to eat for breakfast. So I'm just throwing that out there for you. But I have to point this out because we make it sound like John Harvey Kellogg spearheaded the cereal industry, which he did not.
No.
So anyways, sorry. It's bad research. That's all I have to say. Just bad research.
Yeah, and we don't know who wrote the script she's reading. So
yes.
Yeah, it's just not factual. You're not attacking anybody.
No. I listen, I've seen some of their shows. Some of them are very good. But when you know the other side of the equation, you're like, well, that's really not good research.
Well, I've got you here to set the record straight. I appreciate it. You can keep playing. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
Breakfast cereal, that was just their most profitable. He had a whole line of he had over 30 patents, including the first veggie burger. Now the question is,
I just stopped right here. I don't know about the veggie burger. I do know that they experimented with nuts and trying to make veggie burgers at that time. What's interesting is that not only it makes it sound like his patents were simply on cereals and veggie burgers and stuff like that. Well, he actually had a couple patents in certain surgical procedures as well. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't just that his whole mind was wrapped around cereal and veggie burgers. That just isn't the case. So I'm just pointing out
light therapy, hydrotherapy, so many things
so many things. Anyways.
Americans at the time were not eating this. Why would they choose to? Why would you want to eat this instead of bacon and eggs that they were eating? Well, a lot of that is because
Hold on. Pause it there.
Yeah.
Bacon and eggs. Media on the brain. Edward Bernays, he was the one that popularized that in the 1920s, bacon and eggs. So that post-dated this period of the popularization of cereal. So they were not eating bacon. Is that correct? I mean, you're the history guy, but
this is great. So you probably read it from the same source I did. Bernays in his own book called Propaganda, astutely called Propaganda. It literally says that. So what Bernays was an evil genius. If you were a novelist and you want to write a story about the ultimate villain, you would do no better than to read Bernays's books. Just read Propaganda and let it sink in your head how this guy masterminded so many things. And one of the things that Bernays was excellent at is Bernays understood indirect marketing. In other words, you didn't know that you were being marketed. And so what Bernays did is that the first a group that came to him was the tobacco. I forget the name of the association, but they came to him. They said, hey, we'd like to sell more cigarettes to women. And he goes, well, what's the problem? He goes, well, women feel that men don't find them desirable, when they smoke.
Unladylike.
It's not ladylike. And so Bernays said, he went to Lucky Strike and he said, if you want women to buy your cigarettes, you need to make them conform with the current fashionable colors that women wear, because they don't want a box of cigarettes that clashes with their clothes. And he was right. They started buying more cigarettes. And then he said, then they came back, they said, that's great. We're selling more cigarettes. How can we sell more cigarettes? Women still aren't smoking nearly enough. And he says, I know what I'll do. And he aligned himself with the early suffragettes, feminists, and he aligned himself with the feminist movement and women's liberation movement. And he said, hey, I have some very wealthy people who will donate to your cause, but we need a little help. We need you to take cigarettes and hold them up as torches for liberty. And a woman is an individual and a leader if she's smoking. And so got even more women to smoke for that reason. So they were very thrilled. So other industries started approaching Bernays. And one of them, of course, let me back up, even better. And then people were saying, and so this is funny. The argument is that no one knew that smoking was bad for you until the 1950s. And I have to point this out. This is something that Adventists and other doctors like them, I'm not saying that they were the only one, but Adventists, Kellogg included, and others advocated against smoking. They were like, smoking's bad, smoking's bad. And they were doing this in the 1870s. They were saying smoking's bad all the way back then. Smoking was bad all the way back then. And they were not alone. There were other doctors who started to believe it. It was published in different journals. But just as Bernays' influence is being felt, the American Medical Association needed some money. And Bernays said, I tell you what, if you can tell your doctors to say that cigarettes help women lose weight, again, appealing to vanity, women, you lose weight, open up their throat, suppresses appetite. If you will do that, you will find that the American Tobacco, whatever conglomerate, will put plenty of money in your coffers. And the American Medical Association said, where do we sign the line? And they did that. So for years, you could go to the American Medical Association meeting and Philip Morris would be there. And the woman the rep, she would be in a nurse's outfit. She wasn't a nurse. And she'd be handing free packets of cigarettes to doctors. So the point is that he was an evil genius. And the point was,
Bernays is your villain. Like, if
yes,
you're not going to find a good conspiracy and a good villain in early John Harvey Kellogg.
Right.
You're just not.
Right.
If you're informed about history.
Right.
Edward Bernays is low-hanging fruit, man. He brags about it. He says, we are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested by men we have never heard of. The invisible government.
Yes.
We are those who will control the group mind. It's like he's the one that brought us bacon and eggs, not cereal.
That's right. And
right? Did you get the punchline?
This brings me to the point. So through this indirect influence that he was using, it was very effective, because you weren't saying, hey, buy my cigarettes. You're using another intermediary to influence you to buy the cigarettes. So the meat and poultry, the packers, they came to Bernays and said, man, people are eating this cereal. How can we fix it? And he said, don't you worry. I have something for you. And what did he do? He went back to the same well, created these boards of doctors who began to lampoon the vegetarian diet and all this other stuff. Now, this is important because somehow we think with the pyramid inverted that somehow the meat, poultry, and dairy industries are not benefiting from this. Like we're just meant to think that, hey, these guys, they're just out there raising their cows, raising their chickens. They're just, living on the land. That's not the way it is. For some small farmers, that is the way it is. But these people with these mega factories slaughtering animals by the tens of thousands each and every day, they are all about the money. And it's probably one of the reasons why meat, in my estimation, is so deleterious for your health, because the way that it's slaughtered, the way that it's packed, the way that it's produced, all of it is so bad. And it's not just Adventists who've been saying this, even though Adventists were some of the earliest leaders on this. I just have to say this. Ellen White, in her writing, she talked about, let's say 1890s, right? I'm just going to say 1890s, right around there. I'm sure we can find it, maybe 1880s. She talks about one of the reasons why meat was so deleterious for health, or not good for you, is because when you slaughter an animal and it's all worked up, all those stress hormones, she doesn't say the word stress hormones that way, but she says that the blood becomes inflamed. The blood becomes inflamed, and everything the animal is feeling at the point of death is now in the tissues, and you eat it. Well, it's interesting that many years later, there was a woman who was autistic. She was the University of Arizona Her name's Temple Grandin. They even did a movie about her with Claire Danes acting as her. And she said the same thing. She said, when you kill a cow and it's all afraid and everything, you get all that cortisol, you get all that dump of hormones in its flesh, and it is a worse product. So what did she do? She created a silent slaughter system where the cows would follow a windy path, so they would be completely at rest. So the time they were put to death, their heart rate was low, they were not stressed out, and it was a better quality product. And so I'm just saying that this idea that these Adventists came up with these wacky ideas, and we are the reason why we have diabetes, is completely off its rocker. There's very little fact here at all. To me, it seems like a lot of opinion. It seems like there's an axe to grind, and I'm not sure why.
Why do Adventists have such low rates of diabetes? Yeah. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Seventh-Day Adventists, they had secured appointments within dietary organizations in the government for decades. One of them was Lena Cooper. She was a protege of Kellogg and his wife. The Kellogg's had a cooking school, and their students went on to develop nursing schools focused on nutrition. Cooper graduated from one of those and went on to establish the American Dietetic Association. She served as on the staff of the Surgeon General, and she created the Department of Dietetics at the National Institute of Health. There are many other Seventh-Day.
All right, so I have to stop right here. I wasn't unable to verify any of that. But let's say, for argument's sake, that Lena Cooper was taught by John Harvey Kellogg. Do we know that Lena Cooper was actually a Seventh-Day Adventist? He did establish other schools. Other people did go to him. A timeline would have been helpful for this, because I tried to look up this idea of Adventists sitting on these boards and being very influential, and I couldn't find it. Now, again, I'd have to go to the book. I'd have to look at the footnotes, but I didn't find these things. And I just have to back up right here. Adventists weren't the only ones who were advocating a plant-based diet. It's like I just pointed out, in 1907, Irving Fisher with Yale, who was, I believe he was an economist, he was so impressed by vegetarian diets, he published in the Yale, it's the Yale Alumni Journal. He published a study where they looked at muscle endurance between those who didn't eat meat and Yale athletes. And he used the staff at the Battle Creek Sanitarium in 1906, and they compared their ability to do endurance exercises, like things like holding up your arms, doing pull-ups, push-ups, jumping jacks. And the vegetarians, or I should say meat abstainers, that's what they were called. They would be vegetarians. They ate, they still consumed some dairy, they still consumed eggs. These guys were so healthy that Yale athletes could not compare. So again, the idea that it was just all these Seventh-Day Adventists coming up with this stuff. Even in 1920, there's a book written by F.C. Gilbert, and F.C. Gilbert in there is writing a bit about the history of the Adventist Church. And in there, he has a whole section where he talks about prophecy being fulfilled. And what he talks about are the principles of Ellen White's health reform. And he goes through all these letters written by eminent scientists who were living in the early 1900s up into the 1920s and 30s, who were basically saying, this diet is scientifically sound. These weren't people who were necessarily Bible readers and things like that. They were just looking at it and said, this makes sense. Even Kellogg, after he walked away from the church, he has quotes from eminent scientists and physicians around the world who actually believe in evolution, and they talk about the importance of the plant-based diet. So this information wasn't just among Adventists. It was being spread all over. And again, Kellogg has a book about vegetarianism, and because he traveled the whole world, he talks about entire cultures that ate very, very little meat. Even one of them, which we still look at to this very day, the Okinawans, who have an ancient culture, consume very little protein. They consume mostly a plant-based diet. They do eat occasional little pork, a little bit of fish, but they primarily subsist off of a purple yam and vegetables. So Kellogg studied this around the world and talked about the people who lived some of the longest places. He looked at blue zones before blue zones were even talked about. And so he wasn't the only one. So this idea that it was the Adventist and this woman is very myopic, considering the amount of data that was out there. And we'll get to the food pyramid, because I don't know where this history is coming from. It doesn't make sense. Everything I looked at it tells us a lot different story, but we'll get there.
Adventists who would then continue to influence the plant-based diet, like this guy, Harry Miller. He was also a Seventh-Day Adventist and a missionary in China. That's how he came up with the idea of soy milk.
So Harry Miller did not come up with soy milk. Kellogg had already used soy milk in the United States Soy
I was
milk,
just giving the thumbs up, Adventist or Adventist. Just,
yes.
just to correct the record on that.
Yeah. So here's the thing: soy milk was invented way before that. The Chinese were using, the Japanese were using it.
Yeah.
Like I said, Harry Miller did not bring soy milk back to the United States. He might have had some there, but it was already in the Battle Creek Sanitarium well before Harry Miller traveled to China as a missionary. So, and again, I just want to also point out, Harry Miller was also against smoking. He said that was bad. So we gotta take our wins where we can. Again, this is an oversimplification of a lot of history, but it feels like it's an oversimplification to make a point, which I'm not sure why you would want to attack a group of people like this.
I don't know what the point is. It's like this group of Adventists they're health enthusiasts and they've had influence on the society around them. They're right. It's healthy. They're good people. I mean, I don't get the conspiracy.
Yeah, I think it's almost like it's a way to lampoon the plant-based diet, saying that it comes from people who were anti-masturbationists, from a woman who was crazy, from a guy who was a typesetter and he was a crazy doctor. And, like it's almost this idea that if we can create this conspiracy about it, then meat's back on the table. That's the only thing I can think of. It just makes it more comfortable. I'm not sure what the end game is, just like you do.
Yeah.
Did you know that came from a Chinese missionary, or an American
No, it didn't.
missionary in China? Now, this influence continues all the way through until in 1988, the American Dietary Association issued a formal acceptance of vegetarianism. Of the 9 reviewers on that board, 8 of them were vegetarians, 5 were Seventh-Day Adventists. The other 3 were vegetarians, but not religiously associated. And 1 was not a vegetarian, but he was funded by Coca-Cola. And then we get this 4 years later.
Okay, so this is interesting because this history here doesn't clock. So I went and researched and I looked at the history behind the food pyramid. It turns out that a good chunk of this history behind the food pyramid actually starts in Sweden. It starts in Sweden because they were looking at the effects of rationing food on the health of the population. Something happened prior to 1988. That was World War II. And there's a whole host of literature that's been published looking at the effects of low protein diets, lack of sugar diets. There was a study I just read prior to coming on where it was published in Science Direct, and they were looking at sugar rationing in Great Britain and the declining rates of diabetes. There was other studies published talking about the people in the Netherlands who were under German occupation, and they were talking about the lack of protein that they had and the declining rates of diabetes, obesity, and all this other stuff. So there was a lot of interest in figuring out, well, how can we make recommendations and build something to help people eat and be healthy, even if the food might be at a scarcity. So that was the reasoning in 1962 that the Swedes began to do it. But even before that, in 1894, there was a gentleman who came up with it. I think his name was Wilbur Atwater in 1894. And he created this box where he would put people in there. And he created this box where people would do everything in this box because he was trying to figure out how can you calculate a basometabolic rate. It was like a calorimeter box. And he was trying to figure out what it was so you could figure out what are the requirements. Because in 1894, just like with Adventists, they were very concerned about obesity. They were very concerned about things like gout. They were very concerned about heart disease, cancer, all this stuff. And they were trying to figure out what was the best diet. So a lot of this developed independently of Seventh-Day Adventists. I have no doubt with Kellogg's influence, I have no doubt with later Loma Linda's influence that there were probably people shuffled here and there. But the food pyramid doesn't come out till 1992. Like it takes a long time for this to come out. And there were other attempts that went into it. So yeah, she even has the date, 1992 food pyramid. So again, I could not find this whole nefarious plot of Adventists who were coming up with this. What I did find is that George McGovern in 1977 tried to promote a plant-based diet. Now, he was a senator from South Dakota, and he did have a group of people, but I could not verify if how many of them were Seventh-Day Adventists. Some were from Harvard, some were from other places, and they were physicians. And he began to talk about this connection between heart disease and plant and animal foods. And he was very close with Ansel Keys, which is someone who created the cholesterol hypothesis, which everyone gets upset about because they're like, well, it was junk science and all this other stuff. But the truth of the matter is that cholesterol because we know so much more about it, LDL, HDL, and there's different fragments of it like that. And so we know a lot more about it today than we did back then. But essentially, they were using this reductionist philosophy to talk about cholesterol, but it was essentially the intake of animal fats, which would lead to this high amounts of lipids in the blood, and that could lead to heart attacks and things like that. And indeed, even though the many people have debunked the cholesterol hypothesis, they all admit that when cholesterol is circulating through the blood and it becomes oxidized, it creates an inflammatory event, which can include the arteries, which can undo all this and lead to all these things. So the point of the matter that I'm making is that McGovern had all these people on there. He was influenced by Ansel Keys, who is not an Adventist. He was influenced by other people from Harvard who were not Adventists. And so he was going to promote a plant-based diet. And so in 1977, at the Senate committee, they were making recommendations on what type of diet you should eat. And McGovern was very much in favor of a plant-based diet. But what happened is the meat industry got in there, and Senator Bob Dole, who was from Kansas, and others of essentially states that had a huge livestock industry, lobbied and said, well, we don't want to take meat out of the recommendations. We need to keep meat in there, and essentially subverted the whole idea of making recommendations. Now, I just want to point out here, the food pyramid was never law. These recommendations were never law. They didn't say you have to eat.
That's a huge point. We're not saying that the healthiest diet should be mandated, are we?
Right. So the point is that this whole history that she's saying here is overly simplified, and I couldn't even find the Adventists who were on the board. And just because some of them went to the American Health Reform Institute that Kellogg started or whatever, it didn't even mean that they had to be Adventists. By the time that any of this is written, Kellogg is long dead and buried in 1943. So this is really trying to make a case where there isn't a whole lot of data there to essentially lampoon this pyramid and make it sound like it was the diet of religious fanatics.
Well, and it's not a great food pyramid because the grains should be whole grains. But, even if hypothetically Adventists had this massive influence,
right,
and people were listening to their dietary advice, I would celebrate that. I would say, praise God. This movement of really nice people are telling everybody eat more fruits and vegetables and beans and whole grains, and people are being persuaded to do it. Like, where's the evil conspiracy there? If things were being mandated and government was intervening to harm people's health, then yeah, there would be a valid theorizing to ask what are the origins of that. But this just seems like a non sequitur all the way through.
Yeah. So as far as I can tell, Adventists did not invent the food pyramid. It doesn't even reflect Adventist thought.
Yeah, I was hypothetical there.
Yeah, no, but you're right. But it doesn't reflect that. It was a suggestion which no one ever followed.
Right.
I don't know how.
Yeah, we were eating more and more meat during the years of that food pyramid.
Listen, I was
so if diabetes was going up, don't blame the food pyramid.
Exactly.
Blame the actual change in the diet.
Listen, I was alive in 1992, and I believe you were as well.
We were about the same age, weren't we?
Right. I don't think either one of us ever consulted the food pyramid or went to McDonald's.
No.
I'm just saying.
Is there more video, or you want to wrap it up here?
Yeah. Well, let's see what she has left.
Okay.
She's just about done. We'll wrap it up in just a few minutes.
The original USDA food pyramid in 1992. Now, I'm not saying that the Seventh-Day Adventists were the only influence in the government development.
That's an important caveat. I wish she would have led with that.
Of that monstrosity. There were other stories to be told, but we know those stories. We're told them a lot. The sugar lobby, the soda lobby, the seed lobby, who benefited from that? We know those stories.
She leaves out also the meat lobby. Like somehow, again, I sympathize with farmers who grow their meat and try to make it healthy so people eat. I really do. Yeah. I don't eat meat, but I sympathize with those who try to raise healthy livestock to get to people. Okay. If I were in charge, I would never take that away from people. But let's be very clear. The meat packers, the poulterers, all those people are a very powerful lobby, and they have made sure that meat is on the menu, no matter how bad it is. They don't like the facts that when it talks about the amount, look, 83% of all antibiotics given in the United States are given to livestock. They don't like to bring up the fact. They don't like the fact that they have to dump tons of ammonia in their processing plants because there's bacteria that they're growing there that is resistant and is not responsive to antibiotics. So again, like I'm not here saying that you need to stop eating meat to save the planet. I believe that the whole climate change things is completely antithetical to biblical wisdom and even to science itself. But what I am saying is, like, why do we mention Big Sugar, soda, Adventist, but we don't mention meat and dairy? I mean, there was a whole argument, like, why do we keep telling children to drink milk? Like, why do we keep telling people to consume milk? That doesn't make any sense. So many people are lactose intolerant. Why is it that milk is a beverage that we give to everyone when it's really for growing calves? It's really for developing people. Like, milk has its place, don't get me wrong, but why would that be its own separate food group is beyond me. So anyways.
This one, I feel like most of us really don't. Like, what about you boys? Did you guys know this about Kellogg's?
Yes, I mean, I took a nutrition class in college, like specific.
I watched the documentary.
Including Sanitarium.
All right, which is that they were just like, yeah, we know. But anyways, so she goes on to talk about how they created these cereals and things like that.
Yeah, folks can watch the rest. Why don't you comment on what else is in there as we wrap up?
Yeah, she talks about how they invented all these things, how they invented veggie foods and things like that. Yes, Adventists have invented veggie foods. Yes, Adventists were the leaders in the cereal business. Most of the cereal business that Adventists had has been sold off to third parties. Yeah. Sadly, I wish that they would have kept it, would have helped employed many of the members of the church, and I thought that would have been smart, but people had very narrow vision, so they sold a lot of that off. So
there have been some junk, foods that have been put out under Adventist names. Like, we can do a lot better than that. We've never endorsed, sugar, refined grains, seed oils, but some folks have gone a little sideways on the purity of the health message in their food production. So we'll acknowledge that and call that out.
Yeah, we absolutely. But that isn't being faithful to the health message.
Exactly.
That's producing food in spite of it.
Yeah.
And again, like even the veggie meats, the veggie meats were basically a transition to help people who were struggling giving up their meat to transition. It wasn't like you shouldn't eat veggie burgers 3 times a day. Your plate shouldn't be some sort of fake meat. I refuse to eat most fake meats. I think I might do a fake turkey once a year, and that's it, man. That's it. I don't want them. I need to eat more vegetables, more fruits, more things like that. The whole point is that I believe that she's oversimplified the case and essentially tie in this sort of strange religious group with this terrible food pyramid, which Adventists wouldn't have endorsed back then. We were leaders against staying away from processed sugars. Now, there was an article that I had, I think we talked about it one time on fluoride, and it was talking about these 2 dentists, and they were talking about the best way to prevent cavities was not to fluoridate the water, but to essentially remove sugar intake. And they were saying that back in the 50s and 60s. So they were ahead of the curve in so many of these things. And so to sit there and say that when you realize that, well, wait, one of the blue zones in the entire world is Loma Linda, California, where people generally practice a pretty clean form of the health message. It's not even perfect there, but they get their exercise, they get their sunlight, they eat fairly well, and they live to past 100. Clearly something's working for them. Yeah. And like you mentioned, all those other studies where Adventists who are stricter on their diet generally live longer than those who don't. Mm-hmm. So to sit here and overly simplify, to me, says that either you're looking at everything through meat-colored glasses or you have an axe to grind. I don't know.
Well, it is what it is. You've corrected the record in a truth-filled way, and I appreciate it, Dr. Tim. How can people find you on Rumble's, where you do most of your activity, right?
Yeah, I have 2 channels. I have Rumble. It's Restoring the Right Hand, and then I have Prophetic History and Archaeology. I also have 2 books. One is a petition to the Seventh-Day Adventist, and the other one is a motivational book for entrepreneurs, missionaries, and things like that. I go through a lot of history, and it's basically to help people to see that things like perseverance, honesty, integrity, all these things are values that people can exercise in the secular world that will always bring you success. Not success monetarily, but success in building strong relationships, having a stronger family, and obtaining true success, which is where you have success in the sight of God, not always in man. So I wrote a book like that's called Light Bulbs for Professionals, and both of them can be found on Amazon.
Well, send me the links. We're going to post that in the description, and maybe we'll do an interview on that one. I have not. I've not been in touch with you enough. That just came out, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
Yeah. I remember when you were working on it. So
Yeah.
I'm excited. I want to get it.
Awesome.
So yeah, we'll put it in the link, and let's have a conversation about that one next time. So thanks everybody for joining us, and God bless each and every one of you as you pursue health, and may we all know Jesus as our Lord and Savior, as the center of everything we do and live and have our being in him. So we'll see you next time on the Belt of Truth podcast. I'm Scott Ritsema. God bless you all.